Augustus Stahl wasn't fond of visiting the Retribution these days. Every time he came over, there seemed to be more Xenos, more rabble, and more chaos. He vastly preferred staying on the Reaper. As a Scythe-class cruiser, it had been absolute bleeding edge at the end of the war. 10 years on, it was still one of the most advanced ships humanity had ever built. Completely different from the Retribution, of course. His ship was designed for stealth work and surgical strikes. Unlike the massive bulk of the Retribution, or even Bloodaxe's Viking-class battlecruiser, Stahl didn't rely on blistering broadsides, but very specific strikes and missile barrages. Thinking of Bloodaxe's ship, Stahl shook his head. What had once been the Dauntless was now named Itzpapalotl. What the hell kind of name was that? Apparently, while learning about human history, Bloodaxe became fascinated with the Aztecs, and specifically this obsidian butterfly, with obsidian knives for wings. It was a Viking-class ship. Giving it the name of some sort of butterfly death god doesn't make sense. Then again, it wasn't like the Xeno had good taste about anything else. Unlike Stahl's organized commando squads, the Xeno presided over bloodthirsty berserkers and waves of cannon fodder. As if thinking about the unpleasant Xeno was enough to summon him, the lift stopped and the door opened to reveal Bloodaxe and his entourage. Stahl and the Xeno stared at one another for a moment before Stahl tilted his head to the side and stepped to the left with his escort. He never stepped foot off the Reaper these days without at least two of his best. Garcia and Wasitsko were his best. In their skull-faced power armor, they were as tall as most Grax. Not Bloodaxe, of course. He'd won so many battles that he truly towered over everything but mech suits, which is likely why Bloodaxe and his entourage were using the central lift that was built to accommodate mech suits. The Grax were an odd species. Stahl wasn't even sure if male gender terms actually applied to Bloodaxe or not. He remembered Cookie had told him once about their complex growth and breeding habits, but he'd been too disgusted to pay close attention. The Grax were quite literally products of their environment. Skin, fur, scales. They could grow any of it depending on their climate and more specifically the creatures they would kill and eat. They also kept growing so long as they kept winning fights. Their Death World home was incredibly brutal, and there was evidence that some long-lost ancients had purposefully put them there. But Andromeda didn't have time to study such things, so instead, she'd recruited the barbaric Xenos and moved on. Every Grax had similar features: 4 arms, hulking size, 4 eyes, and wide faces with bone ridges all across them that had both practical and cultural importance. Since Bloodaxe had been raised only on that horrible Death World, he was crisscrossed in ragged scars that bisected his patchy fur laid over thick scales. But most of his entourage was young enough to have developed more skin thanks to the humans they'd been eating. Stahl was no fan of the conglomerate and had killed more than his fair share of Congos. But eating them? He often questioned how necessary their Xeno allies truly were. They'd bolstered their ranks, however, and constantly provided a very steady front-line assault force, which gave his commandos the freedom to work behind the lines. So he couldn't completely dismiss them. He just found them disgusting and distasteful, something Bloodaxe knew. Such pretty trinkets. How well will vanity serve you in combat? Augustus's nose crinkled at the words as if he'd smelled something vile. He looked down over his pristine white, gold, and silver uniform for a moment. Then he glanced back up at the Xeno whose modesty was only hidden by a basic loincloth. I've still got a higher kill count than you. How well does being a savage suit a starship captain? Get your port sensor suite operation yet, or are you blind still? The Xeno hissed out at that, and Augustus could see him seethe, each of his 4 hands tightening into fists. I am unparalleled on the field by our enemy. My failings commanding my ship are being rectified. You would not last but a moment against me in hand-to-hand combat. Oh, the beast that's 3 times my weight and covered in hard scales would beat me in hand-to-hand. I never would have guessed. Would you instead prefer to duel with sniper rifles at a distance of 3 miles? Or just go ship to ship? I'm not intimidated by my lack of physical prowess, Savage. My brain is my most dangerous weapon, while yours just takes up space in that meat sack you call a head. Augustus was tired of the Grax captain constantly threatening him with hand-to-hand. Bloodaxe hissed out once more when a younger Grax started to dart forward as he moved to pull his own axes free. As he did that, Garcia and Wasitsko raised their guns, but Bloodaxe was already shoving the younger Grax back into the corner and bellowing in his face. Augustus's translator couldn't make out any of their guttural language, but the body language made it clear Bloodaxe was tearing his subordinate a new one. Stahl made a subtle gesture with his hand, and Gracia and Wasitsko lowered their weapons, taking a more relaxed stance. When Bloodaxe was done with the other Grax, he turned back. "My apologies, Captain. My son is filled with the eager confidence of youth." Stahl eyed the other Grax more closely then. He supposed he could see the resemblance, though the youth had far more skin than fur or scales. More importantly, he noticed the very similar bone ridges, and especially the massive two-handed axes on the Xeno's back. They were the same as Bloodaxe's namesake. Instead of metal, the blades were made with a crimson obsidian found on their death world. Bloodaxe was one of the few who still used the stuff. Perhaps that's why he was fascinated with the ancient Aztecs. That, or he was a savage who was studying history for ways to become worse. While Augustus studied the younger Grax, he stepped forward and tilted his body forward in what might have been the shallowest bow Augustus had ever seen. "I show you my deference." "Your difference?" Augustus asked. Bloodaxe growled out and shoved the boy back. "He means respect. He does not understand that you and I spar with words. He thinks we mean to trade undue insult. Someday he shall understand wordplay, but that is not today." Augustus arched his brows up as the Xeno said that. Did Bloodaxe think they were friends? Now he was confused. "Ah, quite. Either way, he should save his respect for our commander. This, we agree completely on," Bloodaxe said with a nod. Soon the lift stopped and Bloodaxe nodded to Stahl, waving him forward, letting him step off with his escort first before the Grax and his entourage followed. They walked down the hall past 3 security checkpoints, which Stahl was glad to see were still staffed. Then again, even if the rabble who made up the crew of the Retribution ever tried to take the bridge, they'd have to deal with Andromeda and her lifeguard. Stahl wasn't sure how many thousands it would take to kill that team. He always preferred visiting Andromeda on the bridge instead of her new makeshift throne room. The 2 mech suits standing guard at the entrance to the bridge looked like they had more art on them than last time. For a bunch of undisciplined pirates, Stahl was always surprised at how many of them could paint. Perhaps their art degrees were why they needed the money that came from a life of piracy. He smirked at the thought and walked into the bridge. Due to the size of the Retribution, the bridge was massive. Here were the core men and women he remembered from the war. Their uniforms, or lack thereof, might have changed, but they were still some of the best in the fleet. Well, the new fleet. Stahl took a deep breath as he had to remind himself that there wasn't really a fleet anymore. 3 warships and a colony ship, plus all those merchantmen and freighters, but he didn't really count them. The war was over, and yet he'd never stop fighting, would he? How could he? Maybe if he had been there. His guilty conscience nearly made him walk into the central nav table, and he stopped up short as he looked around for any sign of Andromeda or her lifeguard. When he didn't, he instead looked up at the gleaming red eye high above them in the ceiling. "Admiral," he said before nodding and clicking his heels yet again. Why address him so early? Surely the mistress of the galaxy wishes for your show of submission to be before her, Bloodaxe asked as Stahl sighed. "He's not a deity, Bloodaxe." Stahl had tried to explain this to the Xeno many times, but the concepts of AI or anything like it was entirely incomprehensible to the Xeno. Surely he is. He is the father of the galaxy. I understand fully that in his undeath he is sealed within legend. Never shall his greatness fade from the mind of those who inhabit this fleet. My crew pray to him daily. Stahl glanced over at the Xeno with a bit of surprise. Was he trying to turn Admiral Suvakov into a god? He'd have to look into it. Surely Andromeda wasn't interested in supporting such dangerous nonsense, was she? No, surely not. Ignoring the Xeno for now, he wandered over to one of the ensigns at the engineering communication panel. Is Chief Engineer Branch up? Yes, Captain. Would you like to speak with him? I would, Stahl said with a nod. The ensign tapped on the panel, and Stahl was soon looking at a video of Branch's face. Hello there, Otto. The engineer jerked a bit at that and looked around before looking up at the camera. Around him, the camera could see his usually messy workstation. Stahl found it amusing that the engineer kept his engine room clean as possible, but never remembered to clear his own desk off. Then again, he was often busy monitoring the various reactors and keeping all of the ship's engineering teams organized. The Retribution needed constant work. Caught me while I was a bit focused on my work, Augustus. We're breaking apart some of those Xeno reactors we ripped from the wreckage, trying to see if we can learn anything new, he said, waving forward at something off camera that Stahl couldn't see. Have we? He asked, always happy to hear when they'd worked out some new design or prototype. Anything to keep the fleet as strong as possible. Not yet. The gray-haired engineer rubbed the heavy stubble along his jaw as he looked off camera. Stahl could see the dark circles under his eyes. Getting much sleep? The engineer snorted at that and shook his head. Barely any. What's wrong? Stahl hadn't heard about any major issues with the Retribution, but being the chief engineer of a ship this size was no small task. He also might have long nights simply thinking about the course his life had taken since the end of the war. Lord knows how many nights Stahl had stayed up thinking about that himself. Nothing's wrong except the fucking gobcos. Every night when I lock up my room to sleep, the bastards crawl in through the vents. And then I wake up nearly suffocating under a pile of them. I tell you, they're fucking amazing with the ship and keeping it all together. But I could do without them thinking I'm their ma or whatever the hell they think. Stahl chuckled at that, smirking a bit as he shook his head. Such a fine mother you make, Otto. Har har, blow it out your ass, funny man, came the engineer's growling reply, which made Stahl chuckle a bit louder. So we take any major damage in the fight? Their swift destruction of the Desvian fleet had seemed all too easy, but it was clear the Xenos had been taken by complete surprise. Nah, they barely got any shots off. Those small patrol ships they've got couldn't even take a single hit from the main gun. Yeah, well, how many ships can? Perhaps more of these than in the past. I'm not impressed with their engines or their guns, but I'll say their shields seem to be far away and better than what we got, he said with a slow nod which made Stahl arch his brows in surprise. Then why did we trash them so quickly? They require a much longer charge-up than ours, but I think we can fix that and improve ours altogether. Well, I say that, but truly I've only just started looking at 'em, so the fuck do I know? The engineer snorted. But I should get back to that now, so I'll know more soon enough. Well, I'll let you get to it then. He paused, and then looked very serious, and frowned as he spoke again. But what's this strange rumor I hear about you having a control stick welded to your pants? The engineer looked up at the camera with an equally serious face before saying, Yar, it be driving me nuts! Then they both laughed heavily at their positively ancient joke with one another. Looks like you're about to be called on Augustus. Talk to me later, we need to catch up, Otto said and pointed at the camera. Stahl looked over his shoulder and saw Andromeda approaching. Indeed, I'll talk to you later, Otto. Stahl nodded at the camera and then the ensign who cut the call. With that pleasant little conversation over, he walked back to the nav table as Bloodaxe greeted Andromeda. Captain, Bloodaxe said with a deep bow, upper hands over his heart as the knuckles of his lower arms brushed along the floor before he straightened back up. Now he looked up at the red light and set two of his hands over his heart while the others spread wide. Father of the galaxy, I wish for your good graces. Stahl had to hand it to the Xeno he knew how to show his respect. Get your tongue out of my father's ass, Bloodaxe, Andromeda said with a snort. Stahl noticed the Xeno's son shift a little, bristling at the comment. I show him the respect he deserves for bringing to this universe a woman so powerful she might claim the very name of a galaxy to herself. He dipped his head, steepling the fingers on all of his hands as if in prayer. Andromeda laughed while Stahl examined the new Xeno who was next to her. The sad, somewhat defeated look on his face was familiar to Stahl, and that torn and stained uniform her wore made it clear who he was. So this is the Desvian captain? Stahl asked. He is, Andromeda said with a nod. Judging by that confused look on his face, you've removed his translator, Stahl mentioned as he examined the Xeno. Cookie took it out, yes. He'll have to learn English the hard way. And if you're wondering, he's so far been behaving himself since I made it clear I meant business. She said, knowing Stahl well enough to expect his next question. I suppose that means he hasn't seen the harness yet, then. Andromeda and the lifeguard laughed at Stahl's comment, while he noticed the Xeno looking confused at the laughter, and even Junko blushed a bit deeper. Ah. Based on the nervous look the poor girl hard on her face, she would be expected to join them tonight. Stahl always wished he could do something for her, but he didn't dare get between Andromeda and her favorite secretary. Instead, he changed the topic and waved at the nav table. So their computer has been integrated? Yes, Andromeda said with a nod as she turned to the table and started punching in codes on the side. Stahl examined her for a moment. It seemed so strange to him that he'd remembered her being a tiny little baby crying in her father's arms, her mother's body still warm. How long ago that was. He had been just a 20-year-old ensign that fateful and terrible day. Now she was a crimson-haired demon of a pirate. He idly wondered how many people knew that wasn't her natural hair color. He smirked a bit at the thought. But then he glanced back up at the red eye in the ceiling and stopped smiling. Fucking thing! Andromeda growled and kicked the side of the table. If I may, sir, Junko offered as she stepped up. Andromeda stepped back and angrily waved Junko forward. The girl quickly punched in the correct codes and Stahl saw it start to flicker to life. When Junko adjusted her glasses, Stahl wondered if he might be able to get one of his fabricator teams to make her contacts or something. Amid all these violent soldiers and pirates, he felt the freckled Asian girl seemed so delicate and vulnerable. Too late he realized Andromeda had caught him staring and tried to play it off by slowly looking elsewhere. Busted Stahl. One of these days you're just going to have to ask, what's the worst that happens? I tell you no, I won't share my toys. Stahl shifted uncomfortably and adjusted his uniform to try and cover his movements while Andromeda laughed. By the confused looks of everyone else, she was the only one who had noticed. The fact that she mistook his genuine concern for lust. He was old enough to be her father. Oh, how Andromeda had changed in the 10 years since the final Battle of Castor. His guilty thoughts returned as he thought of his failure to be there. He'd gone over the records 1,000 times, of course. There was nothing his small ship could have done to change the outcome of the battle, but that didn't stop him from feeling somehow responsible. He forced himself back into reality, though, when the display zoomed in and focused on the sector of space they were now on the edge of. Here's the Desvian Kingdom, Andromeda said as she waved a hand at a bronze-colored sector of space. Stahl noted that the map was centered on a position at the center of the local sector with Earth somewhere rimward, and the nebula spinward of that point. In fact, the nebula bordered the entire spinward portion of this sector, and trailed along both the coreward and rimward sections of the map. Why haven't they expanded into the nebula? He asked, noticing that there weren't any Desvian claims in the nebula. Because they're scared of it, Andromeda said matter-of-factly, and these black holes block them in along this section as well. From where Stahl was looking, the north of the kingdom was blocked in by the edge of the nebula and some black holes that would likely make navigation nearly impossible. That left the rest of the local nations for them to fight with over territory. So where's their homeworld? Stahl asked, before Andromeda tapped on a planet roughly in the center of the kingdom. So why is the map oriented around this planet here? He asked, reaching over to tap the planet at the center of the sector. This was a Desvian map, after all. Wouldn't they focus their maps on their home? That's a good question. Andromeda looked back at the captain and then nodded to Junko. Junko, translate for us. Why is that the center of their map? Junko turned then to speak with the captured Desvian. Their language sounded surprisingly Latin-based to Stahl, like something he could possibly learn on his own, unlike the impossible languages of the Grax or Sharkin. The Xeno spoke back to Junko, and then the girl looked at Andromeda. That is the planet of peace. The nations use this planet for negotiations and consider this sector to essentially be demilitarized. Diplomats and flagships only. The Xeno spoke once more and began to gesture at the map and the various colors marking sections of space. Rimward of the Desvian Kingdom was mostly grayish space with small colored dots. Apparently this section held a number of free planets. Minor species with limited holdings. They used to belong to... She looked over at the Desvian, who began to point and talk once more. Apparently this planet? She tapped on a bright red mark straight south, or rimward of the Peace Planet, is home to a species of ultra-aggressive insectoid warriors. They weren't spacefaring when they were first discovered, but some well-meaning yet stupid species I'm not familiar with yet landed on the planet with the intent of making contact. Instead, they were enslaved, and then the insects began to spread across the local systems at an alarming rate, killing or enslaving everyone they came across. She paused then so she could listen to the Xeno explain further. It required the combined strength of all other nations in the sector to push them back and eventually seal them back into their home sector. Seal them in? They didn't kill them outright? Stahl asked. Junko spoke back and forth with the Xeno for a moment. Apparently they built planetary defense cannons on an unprecedented scale, which kept the civilized fleets out. But the species itself is apparently terrible at all kinds of engineering. And so, as their slaves died, what remained of their fleet fell into serious disrepair, and they're now stuck back on their homeworld. Since that time, the systems in the area are used as a buffer zone by the civilized nations in case they ever break the quarantine. They're actively quarantined? Andromeda asked, and waited for Junko to speak back and forth. Apparently every nation is supposed to help in this task, but since it's been a few centuries since the war, other nations aren't giving their fair share of support. He claims the Desvians still patrol the region, though, in accordance with some treaty. Stahl could already see the gears turning in Andromeda's head as she tugged on her lower lip. Do they engage in any diplomacy? Do they have a language that's coherent? Or do they communicate through pheromones and other insect stuff? She waited for the back and forth once more. The Germo have limited trade with them. Apparently their homeworld is very resource-rich. They can't be very fearsome warriors if the cowardly space turtles can trade with them safely. Stahl looked over at Bloodaxe's son, then who had said that, and noticed Andromeda's annoyed look at having a low-ranking subordinate speak out of turn like that. "I'm sorry, do you have something to say about our trading partners, the Germo?" she asked, as she turned to face him fully now. Her lifeguard shifted as well, directing their attention to the Xeno. Stahl could see Bloodaxe trying to subtly signal for his son to shut up, but the Grax just kept at it. "They're good for nothing besides having tasty shells we can crack open so we may feast upon them. You did us wrong by not letting us devour their emissary." When he said that, Andromeda arched her brows and tilted her chin down. "Oh, I did you wrong, did I? By dealing fairly with a trade fleet of Xenos who were happy to give us translators and some information about the sector we are traveling into? It was wrong of me not to let some pissant Grax get a little nibble, huh?" Her tone was full of mock sincerity as the Grax bristled. He looked ready to step forward and say more, but Bloodaxe set a hand on his shoulder heavily. "Please, my commander, this is his first meeting of such import. He understands not why his words are poorly chosen." Bloodaxe glared at his son, then who finally kept quiet. "Bloodaxe, who the fuck is this?" she asked, clearly annoyed now that her meeting was getting derailed. This is my son. Pardon his brash words. He is young and energetic. More like dangerously stupid and aggressive," she countered. Stahl slowly took a step back as his escort did the same. Even the other Grax slowly began to back away from Bloodaxe and his son. They all heard the tone in her voice. "You are one to call me stupid and aggressive human!" The younger Xeno hissed out before actually spitting as he said that. The grayish blob flew from his mouth, landing on the floor well short of Andromeda. When it hit the floor, Stahl heard the hush fall over the bridge. People had been murmuring quietly as they did their jobs without trying to be too loud. But now everyone was silent and staring. After a moment, Andromeda just pointed at the blob of spittle on the deck. "Lick that up!" "You!" the Xeno growled out before Bloodaxe firmly gripped his shoulders, shoving him back as he began to talk to his son in their own language. Stahl could see how angry Bloodaxe was, but there was an element of fear and worry to it. The son argued back with his father for perhaps a minute before Andromeda suddenly spoke up. "Is that what you think of me, you little shit stain?" Stahl was just as surprised as Bloodaxe and his son obviously were. You speak our tongue?" Bloodaxe asked, the color draining from the fleshy parts of his face. "Not so keen on talking shit right in front of my face now, are you?" she asked with a growl. "It matters not!" the son said, shoving his father aside as he drew the two massive axes on his back. Andromeda's lifeguard had their weapons up and ready before he was even finished, but Andromeda actually waved them down. "If he wants to challenge me, that is his right," she said coldly before Bloodaxe dropped to his knees, all four hands clasped together. "Mistress of the Galaxy, please do not accept this. He is young! He knows not the true impact of his actions." Stahl could see nothing but fear on the Xeno's face now. To be honest, Stahl felt sorry for him. He couldn't imagine watching his own son die before him like Bloodaxe was about to. And yet he has made his own decisions. If I don't accept his challenge, that means I am not fit to hold my title. "I do have plans, however, so I'll make it quick," Andromeda said as she moved to pull her cutlass free with her right hand and her dagger out with her left. The thing was, Stahl knew something most people didn't. Andromeda was left-handed. "Yes, your death will be quick!" the Grax bellowed as he began to charge forward, his four arms holding the axes out wide, swinging them in together to try and catch Andromeda between the two swinging blades. But instead, she dashed forward into his charge, no longer trying to draw her long cutlass as she dove between the Xeno's legs. As she slid under him, she rolled onto her back and slashed out with the dagger, and Stahl grimaced as he watched the blade cut right through the Xeno's left Achilles tendon. He could see the muscle roll up into the Xeno's calf. The Grax screamed in pain, dropping onto his knee as that leg suddenly refused to support his weight. He did turn his upper body, trying to strike at Andromeda with his right-hand axe. Now she had to roll back, narrowly avoiding the blade. But when she sprang to her feet, she was far enough away from the Xeno that she could draw her cutlass freely. The Grax was gasping in pain as he tried to stand up, but just wobbled on the one good leg as his left now simply couldn't support any weight. He almost stood as he used his left axe for support, but once he put pressure on his left leg, he staggered to the side and collapsed, sending the axe sliding across the deck to Stahl's feet. "Please, Andromeda, I beg of you to spare him. I will serve you with all my dedication and heart." Bloodaxe was pleading now, but Andromeda just looked over at him with a cold expression. "Did you not already pledge that to me when I brought your species on board my fleet to rescue you from your home?" The Xeno gulped visibly at that. Yes, of course." His eyes were downcast now. "I cannot reasonably ask of you for mercy, but I still must ask. He is my son." Andromeda looked back at the struggling Xeno, then who still clutched an axe in his right hands. "Do you yield?" she asked, extending her cutlass with one hand, aiming it at the Xeno. A mixture of emotions seemed to flash across his face. Anger, hatred, fear, and more. But then the Xeno seemed to take hold of his anger and growl out, "A true Grax does not submit to some promiscuous female who has not been put in her place. Females deserve no standing of authority at all, let alone commander." Stahl was rather surprised to hear that, and Andromeda looked surprised as well just before her expression grew angry as she sneered. "Tell me, Bloodaxe, is this true? Does a true Grax not submit to a promiscuous female?" The Xeno gulped and couldn't meet her gaze. "The boy knows not what he says," the Xeno responded quietly. Andromeda just snorted and looked back at the struggling son. "The term you're looking for, by the way, is slut. And the fact that you think my sex life has any impact on my ability to command means you clearly don't understand me or my history. I'm tempted to make your death long and painful to set an example to any other true Grax." She spat the words out and looked down at the kneeling Bloodaxe. "But," she sighed out, seeming to release her anger until the Grax interrupted her. "But what, wench? Always talking. Always. Such useless words. Someday a Grax will cut your tongue from your mouth. See your place sealed." Andromeda's eyes lit up with a fire deep inside them as she simply stepped forward, parried the Xeno's weak slash with his axe, and then drove her blade into his throat. He finally let go of the other axe as two of his hands moved up to try and stem the tide of green blood seeping from the wound. Since the Grax had exceptional blood-clotting abilities and were incredibly robust, a slit throat wasn't as fatal as it was for a human. But as he clutched that wound shut, Andromeda stepped closer, jamming the dagger into his upper right bicep, yanking on it hard to open up a massive cut in his scales and flesh, causing more green blood to gush out. This kept up as she would move around the Xeno, adding cut after cut, while he couldn't defend himself, until he finally slumped to the floor of the deck in a puddle of his blood. The Grax could take plenty of injuries and keep going, but Andromeda knew just where to strike, having opened up tendons, muscles, veins, and arteries until the Xeno's body finally gave out. Andromeda stood over the Xeno's body and then looked over at Bloodaxe. That was as quick a death as I could give him, considering the insult. The big Grax wasn't crying, but his shoulders were slumped, and Stahl could only imagine the pain inside his heart right now. I thank you, Mistress of the Galaxy, for what mercy you could bestow. May I tend to the body? Yes, that's fine, she said, and then stepped away from the dead Xeno and back to the nav table. Stahl didn't know his name. This realization hit him suddenly as he saw Bloodaxe slowly crawl across the deck to his son's body. But rather than watch the Xeno as he was about to undergo whatever death ritual his people had, Andromeda snapped her fingers and made him look up. Stahl, focus. Yes, Captain, he said with a nod and clicked his heels. She pointed to the triangular nation trailing the insect homeworld, as Stahl tried to remember what they'd even been talking about before the fight happened. Junko. What's this place? Ah. Junko had to adjust her glasses, as she also obviously needed to regain her composure. She spoke to the Desvian captain, who looked a little shaken up from what he'd witnessed, but soon he was back on point with the map. This is the Narilic theocracy. They were the ones who found those insects. They used to span half this sector, but have never recovered fully from that war. Coreward of that nation was a skinny blue tendril that drove a wedge between the theocracy and a dark violet nation above it. That's the Wesson technocracy, Xenos, who had been approached by missionaries of the Narilic, who then warped the religion into some sort of machine god cult. They're now a sort of splinter extremist cult from the theocracy. They aren't very important and their holdings are quite small, as you can see. That map is only an estimate of their territory, apparently, and it might be even smaller. Next, she pointed to the dark violet territory that seemed at least as large as the theocracy. These are the Ba'an clans. Despite the name, they are very close-knit systems with united ideology but multiple species. I can't quite tell what sort of government they are since his description is somewhat contradictory, but perhaps a communist democracy. She shrugged before tapping on the last nation on the map marked with a rich blue. They were between the Ba'an and the Desvians and seemed to rival the Desvians in size. Finally, the Fexians. He says they're a collaboration of arrogant principalities who choose an emperor through some sort of convoluted system of voting. I understand they've been age-old enemies with the Desvians, though he admits they are worthy adversaries. Junko paused then as the Decevon captain spoke again, and pointed at places along the map before moving his hands in a flowing motion. Oh, and apparently there's a species known as the Kresh. They live in giant migratory fleets that follow around space leviathans? Some sort of space monster, I guess. They harvest them for food and resources to trade with. The Germo also have isolated planets, but no one minds them as their territory is limited, and they mostly just care about trading. Before anything else could be said, a loud cracking sound was heard, and a smell reached Stahl's nose. He let out a disgusted groan, covering his mouth and nose as he turned to see what was going on. Andromeda sniffed and groaned as well before turning around and looking down at Bloodaxe, who had used some sort of obsidian knife to open up his son's chest and was cutting out his heart. Ugh, Bloodaxe, what the fuck? It is custom, he said before holding the grayish organ high in the air and started to chant in his guttural native tongue as the rest of the Grax behind him started to chant as well. All I wanted was a nice, quiet meeting, Andromeda said with a sigh as if killing Bloodaxe's son was more of an inconvenience to her than anything else. But she tapped at a spot at the bottom of the map, rimwards towards Earth. There was a strange blackish blob at that point on the map, though that didn't look like anything Stahl had seen before. The Yermo told me about this place. It's called the Maze. Some ancient species moved around black holes or created black holes, or something along those lines, and created a maze of very narrow paths through this sector of space. At the heart of it is a system with 3 superplanets that are said to be nothing short of a paradise, combined with all the resources a spacefaring nation could ever need. Stahl finally understood why Andromeda had pushed hard into this sector of space now. You want to land the colony ship there? Yes. When the conglomerate finally pushes this far towards the core, they'll have to pass this area. And when that happens, I want us to be established. I want to know every parsec of that maze, and I want to be ready to hit them hard. They might have stolen our home from us, but I'll make damn sure they don't get a foothold in this sector so they can expand further and do that to anyone else. However this place changes things. She tapped on the bright red insectoid planet. I want to see if we can get ourselves some allies. And I assume you'll want me to forge ahead and scout the maze? At least for now. Stahl nodded. It seemed like a decent enough plan. Their 3 warship fleet would never be able to protect a normal system from the conglomerate once they showed up. But if it was at the O and I want you to take on new recruits, your crew is getting to dangerously low levels, Stahl. That made him blink and look back up at Andromeda. What? But you know I can't just use any rabble. My ships is filled with commandos. They're well-trained and very experienced. The Xenos you've recruited lack... He glanced past Andromeda at Bloodaxe eating his son's heart while the other Grax kept chanting, Discipline. Use the Desvians. They have Marines, and it's clear that they're more human than the Grax or Sharkin. It's not like you can wait another 8 years for the first generation of kids on the colony ship to come of age, Stahl. You need more recruits. Augustus sighed at that and glanced at the Desvian. Despite being overwhelmed quickly, he'd heard that their Marines had fought with at least some organization. Of course, Commander Suvakov, he said with a nod and clicked his heels. Don't do that, Augustus, Andromeda replied with a frown. What? He blinked at her comment. You always do that when I give you an order you don't like and you try to treat it like I'm your superior officer, and you just have to deal with it. She looked annoyed, but not angry. Commander Suvakov, you are my superior officer, superior in every way, so I do have to just deal with it. I'm not going to pretend to like it, but I will do what you tell me. They locked eyes for several seconds before she slowly nodded. I'd rather have you agree with me, but I suppose if you always agreed with me, I'd never have any use for your advice. Junko will help you pick the best of the Desvians to train. I don't need you to take that many of them, but for God's sake start integrating Xenos into your command. I can't keep talking about equality and opportunity in my recruitment speeches if one of my captains won't use any Xenos. I understand, Commander Suvakov. Stahl paused as he thought over his words carefully. I didn't think any of the species we've met so far would work well as commandos. I'm sure the Desvians will be adequate, and I should have more diversity in my command. That said, I'm not lowering my standards. If 100 pass the test, or 1, that will be all I use. He stood tall then, lifting his chin as he looked at her. Andromeda just laughed and rolled her eyes. For fuck's sake, Stahl, we're pirates now. You don't have to get all huffy about your command. But fine. Only accept those who pass your standard commando training. No making it harder. Of course, he said with a nod. Finally, she turned to start walking away, Junko, the Desvian, and the lifeguard walking towards the back of the bridge. Someone clean up the mess when I'm gone. Scrub the deck clean! I better not smell dead Grax when I come back. I have to introduce my new playthings to my dogs so they can get familiar with their scents. As she walked away, Stahl looked at the grieving Bloodaxe, who likely had missed everything Andromeda had said to Stahl about the map and her plan. Stahl reached down and picked up the axe that had been knocked across the deck to his feet, and approached the Xeno. This is yours, he said, holding out the massive weapon, finding the heft and weight to be uncomfortable in his hands. It was once, before I gave it to my son. Who now does it belong to? I have failed as a father. Stahl shifted uncomfortably as he had never expected to feel sorry for the Xeno. You can have other children. I'm sorry for your loss, but he got himself killed. Stahl was terrible at this sort of thing. He did. The Xeno nodded. Then he looked up and reached out, setting his hands on the axe. But when Stahl tried to let go, the Xeno pushed it back into his hands. Keep this, my friend. The axes have failed my child. My next shall not be trained as I have. Please understand this was once my axe and still contains some of my heart. When again I try to raise another, I will always remember where this resides and the many things you have tried to teach me." Stahl blinked as the Xeno spoke and felt very unsure of what to do, so he simply nodded. "I'll keep it secure until you need it." The Xeno nodded and gave a weak smile. "My thanks again." After that, Bloodaxe leaned back over the body of his son and started to cut out a purple organ. As he did, a smell hit Stahl that nearly made him puke, so he quickly turned to leave, still flanked by his 2 commandos. While they walked, Stahl was reminded of the Xeno's words earlier in the lift, and if he had misunderstood their interactions for years. That said, once they were out of the bridge, he handed the axe to Garcia. "Once we get back, have it swept for bugs." "You think he bugged it, sir?" Garcia asked, obviously surprised. "I highly doubt it, but you can never be too sure." "And then disinfect it and have it set into a secure crate. I don't have time to worry about a grieving cannibal. I need to get the crew ready for new recruits." His stride became more confident as he thought ahead to his next task. Heart of a maze of black holes. Well, they might have a chance,